So the title of this is Defense of Dingle on the Twin Paradox. Almost immediately after Einstein came out with relativity, there were people saying he was wrong. Then came World War II, and after World War II, the criticism of Einstein's relativity quietened down. Herbert Dingle seems to provide attention to that criticism. He was eminent enough that when he criticised Einstein's relativity, more attention was paid to the criticism. So this is Professor Dingle. Since about the 1960s, he was saying Einstein was wrong. The way that those pro-Einstein relativity dealt with Herbert Dingle's opposition was to misrepresent his position and then try to ignore him, dismissing him as not knowing what he was talking about. His main criticism was as regards to the twin paradox. So let's look at the twin paradox. As per what Wikipedia says, in physics the twin paradox is a thought experiment in special relativity involving identical twins, one of whom makes a journey into space in a high-speed rocket and returns home to find out that the twin who remained on Earth has aged more. So I'll leave you to read the rest for a minute. So carrying on, this is what it looks like. On the left you've got the twins the same age, and the one with the spacesuit on goes off in the spaceship and then comes back later, and then the twin that stayed on Earth is older than the one who went off in the spaceship, and that's shown on the right hand side. But this twin paradox involves a journey going away and coming back, and so involves an acceleration of the space traveller. It's not the case of both observers being in separate inertial frames, which meaning constant velocity frames. So what happens if you're considering only inertial motion, where both observers are inertial observers? Observer watching rocket says it moves at constant velocity relative to them, and observer on the rocket says person on the Earth moves at constant velocity away from them. And what we're doing is ignoring things like the motion of the Earth around the Sun, and we're treating it as an idealized case of constant velocity with no any accelerations involved. Well, observer A says B clock is slower. Now what does observer B say about the A clock? If B clock is slower, then it should be saying A clock faster. But what relativity principle says is what A observes, so too should B. So B then says the A clock is slower. So it seems to be that from relativity you're saying both observers A and B are saying the other clock is slower. A observer says the B clock is slower. Observer B says the A clock is slower. And that does not really make much sense. So the possibilities are A says B clock slower, B says A clock faster, or the other possibility is A says B clock slower, B says A clock slower. Dingle wants to know what was Einstein's relativity supposed to be saying about this. Was it going for the first option or the second option? And further, the possibility of second option did not seem to make sense. Mainstream seemed to totally ignore that and instead answered a different question, claiming that after a round trip, the space traveller came back younger than the stay-at-home twin. So, pointing out again what Dingle wanted, he wanted to know if the observers were only inertial observers and they had no acceleration, then what was relativity saying about it? And that was his main question, but mainstream didn't answer. So mainstream didn't want to answer the questions that Dingle raised and just wanted to ignore the questions and answer different questions. And the different question was the taking into account the round trip where non-inertial motion was involved. Then it was saying that the twin that travelled was younger than the twin that stayed at home, and that's what the answer they were giving. But they weren't answering the question what was happening if it was just inertial motion, what was going on. And the tactic is called setting up a straw man. So not answering the question and instead answering a different question is just a straw man. So the argument between Dingle and the supporters of relativity goes like this cartoon. First person shouts straw man argument, and that we can represent as being Dingle, and the second man replies, who's supporting Einstein's relativity, look, not every argument you disagree with or misunderstand is a straw man. And Dingle will then shout back to that, another straw man. So Dingle accuses the relativity supporters of not answering his questions. The relativity supporters respond by accusing Dingle of not understanding what he's talking about. And so with that, it's just deadlock. You can make no more progress after that. Both are talking at cross purposes. The main supporters of Einstein relativity are not properly responding to the question that Dingle raises, and then by not properly responding to that are then refusing to properly respond to it and just responding to a straw man. Now, putting it down into mathematical terms, and can get complicated with people disagreeing on the mathematical representations being used. So it just gets worse. You can argue with the words, and then you can put it into the maths, and then it just gets worse. But in terms of the relativity principle, if you believe the relativity principle, then you seem to be believing that there's symmetric time dilation, where each twin will say the other clock is slower. Whereas if you don't believe the relativity principle, then you seem to be believing a preferred frame exists, and that will then give you asymmetric time dilation, where each observer agrees which is the slower clock, while the other clock is faster. So if observer A says B's clock is slower, then B will agree that B's clock is slower. And then both of them agree that A's clock is faster. But that seems to be violating the relativity principle, which says both clocks will be slower. So that's the confusion that happens. Now, if we're going back to Einstein in 1920, he's saying, recapitulating, we may say that according to general theory of relativity, space endowed with physical qualities. In this sense, therefore, there exists an ether. And I'll leave it to you to read the rest of it. What he says is very confusing, but what he seems to be doing is bringing back the ether. He seems to be bringing back a preferred frame. An ether frame would be a preferred frame, and it seems to be abandoning the relativity principle. Seems to be abandoning the relativity principle, which the means he's going for asymmetric time dilation. But all this arguing just goes round in circles. I'll give you a minute to read the rest of what Einstein says. Yeah, you need to be a fast reader, or else pause the video. So what Einstein says is confusing, but he seems to be saying bring back a preferred frame, in which case he's meaning an ether frame, and that seems to be abandoning the relativity principle, and then that means he's going for asymmetric time dilation. But people then can start arguing, well, Einstein got it wrong and it should really be symmetric time dilation, and it just goes on and on in circles like that. So that's the end. Thank you.